All right, everybody. So for this video, I'm going to talk about why Christianity is true. And, really what I mean by that is the historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. I have to say, I've watched a lot of atheists and Muslims and, whoever else try and respond to this argument in debates and YouTube videos and, articles, book, whatever. And I got to say, this argument seems pretty watertight. There's not any response to the evidence Jesus rose from the dead that I've heard that is even adjacent to reasonable. So, with that in mind, I'm going to give this argument for Jesus' resurrection in four premises. So, the first premise of my argument is that it is a historical fact that Jesus at least existed and was crucified, and he had followers claiming to have seen him risen from the dead shortly thereafter. This is pretty much indisputable as far as I know. The second premise we're going to talk about is that the earliest Christians were being threatened to the point of death. It was illegal in Rome to be preaching Christianity. And so because of that, as they say, liars make poor martyrs. They probably weren't lying. The third premise is going to be that group hallucination is impossible. They can't have hallucinated. People don't see the same hallucinations at the same time, and we'll get into that. And so then the conclusion naturally would be, if the first Christians who are claiming to have seen Jesus rise from the dead weren't lying and they weren't hallucinating, then the only reasonable possibility is that Jesus actually did rise from death. So, as it pertains to the first premise, the idea that Jesus at least existed and was crucified and he had followers who were claiming to have seen him risen from the dead, this doesn't prove Christianity. You can be an atheist and agree with this. People claim all kinds of things. People claim to see Bigfoot. They claim to see, UFOs. They claim to see whatever it is. They claim to see miracles of other religions, right? People claim to see whatever. So you can be an atheist and wholeheartedly agree with my first premise, right? I think Muhammad historically existed. I think a lot of characters of other religions historically existed. I just don't think they did any of the magic, right? And so you can say the same about Jesus. And this is pretty much an indisputed historical fact among experts. The only dispute you're going to see about this is from atheists on YouTube. But in terms of actual academic research, there's very little dispute about this first premise. So I do want to point out that this is not just some smoke and mirrors nonsense, how do scholars come up with this idea that Jesus existed and all that. So I've assembled a little chart here, and I'm no digital design expert, it's just a little Microsoft Word document here. But I have looked for every record written within 100 years of different people's death and within 200 years of their death. And I have compared them. And as you can see, the amount of records we have about Jesus existing or people claiming to have seen him risen from the dead completely just overshadows every other ancient historical figure we have, or at least the vast majority of them. Alexander the Great, we have nothing about him within 200 years of his life. Hannibal, we have nothing about him within 200 years of his life. Julius Caesar, we have 5 things about him within 200 years. That's pretty good. I do want to point out that most of our information, 90% of it, comes from these two sources, the later ones, Suetonius and Plutarch. So we're getting most of our information about Caesar, over a century after he dies. And what happens when we compare it to Jesus? We have 11 documents written. And I want to point out, I was being as skeptical as possible. A lot of these writings here, scholars debate on when exactly they're written. So I was really trying to be as skeptical as possible to get as few and as late a sources as I could for Jesus. And even with that, the furthest I can stretch it, within 100 years of Jesus' life, we have these 11 sources. And a few of them are not Christian, if that matters to you. And then within 200 years of his life, I didn't even feel like counting. That would be way too laborious of a task. There's just a ridiculous amount of sources that are talking about Jesus. So I found at least 25 for you. The point here is the idea, the amount of testimony that we have for this early first century cult of Jesus followers claiming to have seen him risen from the dead is overwhelming. If you want to deny that Jesus existed or that there was this small religious cult saying that they've seen him risen from the dead, then you either have to be completely inconsistent or you have to throw out everything we know about ancient history. This is just an undeniable historical fact. Jesus existed, and there was a first century cult of Jews claiming to have seen Jesus rising from the dead. I actually have here a book by Dr. Bart Ehrman. He is considered by many to be the world's leading scholar in a lot of historical Jesus studies, and he's an atheist or an agnostic. And he writes an entire book, Did Jesus Exist? He goes into how it is a historical fact that Jesus existed. And like again, you don't have to be a Christian to agree with that. Again, I think Muhammad exists. I think all kinds of people existed. But this is at least the bare minimum that I need to build my case upon. In terms of this second premise, right? Like the first Christians claiming to have seen the resurrection, they probably weren't lying. This is once again pretty much indisputed in terms of actual academia. The only dispute from this is from like people on the internet that don't know what they're talking about. But the most recent academic publication that I'm aware of that has argued that the first Christians were just like intentionally spreading a known lie was written in 1971. That's like super outdated. If I cited that on one of my papers, I would get marked off for having an outdated source. Like there are no scholars in the modern era, to my knowledge, not one, who argues that Jesus rising from the dead was a known lie, that the first Christians were just intentionally lying. The evidence for this is simply that it's a very well attested fact among ancient sources, including Christian and non Christian sources, that it was illegal to be a Christian in the early centuries. If you went out and preached Christianity, you could have your head cut off. You could be thrown in the Colosseum. You could be lit on fire. You could be whatever the case may be. Christians were a persecuted group. They were a mocked group. They were not well respected within the Roman Empire. And so to go around and preach something that you know is going to get you killed, or at least could get you killed, you're probably not going to do that unless you actually think that what you're saying is true. Again, this doesn't prove Christianity. They could have actually thought Jesus rose from the dead and just been wrong, right? There are totally Muslims who have died for Islam. There are all kinds of people that have died for all kinds of things. But we can at least show here that because the first Christians were willing to preach to the point of death, they probably really did believe that Jesus actually did rise from the dead. Okay, so we've talked about why they probably weren't lying and why there probably really were people in the first century claiming to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. Maybe they were just wrong. Maybe they hallucinated. People see all kinds of things. People think that they see ghosts. They think that they see UFOs. They think they see whatever. Well, the problem with the hallucination hypothesis in this case is a really obvious one. There were a group of early Christians claiming to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. You can't have a group of people all hallucinating the same thing. It's not how hallucinations work. They are a private mishap in my own personal brain, in my own personal perception. Me and my friend and my other friend are not going to all be hallucinating the same thing at the same time. And there's a lot of documentation for this in psychological literature. So, to back this up, I do just briefly want to show this little article, False Theories of the Resurrection. It's StephenRuff.com, I believe. He has found a phenomenal quote that I do briefly want to share. William Dembski, in his book, he says, I have surveyed the professional literature, peer-reviewed journal articles and books written by psychologists, psychiatrists, and other relevant healthcare professionals during the past 2 decades, and have yet to find a single documented case of group hallucination. So, if you want to argue that Jesus' followers really all hallucinated the same Jesus at the same time, they're all just like group hallucinating this thing, then your big problem is that you have to deal with the mountain of psychological data that shows that you're wrong. This is not a possible thing. Group hallucination is subjective. It's a thing happening in my own mind, right? So the idea of a group hallucination is just completely impossible. So the argument laid out goes, if there were really people claiming to have seen Jesus risen from the dead, and they weren't lying, and they weren't hallucinating, then most likely Jesus really rose from the dead. This seems like a pretty solid argument. I would encourage everybody to go read like actual atheist responses to this. I would encourage you to check out Greg Ludeman, Bart Ehrman, whatever. And interestingly enough, the most common pushback against this argument is not a historical one. It is not, we can't actually prove that there really were people claiming Jesus, rose from the dead or whatever. The most common pushback from this is actually just, oh yeah, well, Jesus rising from the dead is impossible, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, or miracles are inherently improbable, or whatever the case may be. The most common response is miracles are impossible. In other words, at the academic level, the most common response to this argument is I have no response to your argument, so I'm just going to insert my atheistic assumptions into the study of history. So, these sort of philosophical responses to the argument that, like, resurrections are impossible, they really deserve a video in their own right. But to put it shortly, just use common sense here. That's circular thinking. You're just inserting assumptions into the study of history about resurrections not being possible, about the idea of a God existing not being possible. You're just asserting these assumptions in there. But a thought experiment, so you can understand how unreasonable this is. To my knowledge, I don't believe that there's any 15-foot long birds out there. From what I understand, science tells us that that sort of thing doesn't exist. It is not possible for me to go outside and find a 15-foot long bird out there. Nonetheless, if a bunch of scientists went into a jungle somewhere and they came back and said, hey, we just discovered a 15-foot long species of bird, I wouldn't say, too bad. I'm going to deny all of this evidence because my preconceived notions about reality disagree with you. No, I wouldn't say that. I would say, okay, clearly there are some things in the world that I haven't witnessed before. Clearly there are some things that are outside of the normal experience, and I'm going to accept that because, well, it seems to be a fact that y'all have witnessed this thing, right? This idea that we should just assume the resurrection is impossible is super problematic from a logical standpoint. In other words, long story short, historians across the board, including non-Christians, say that it is a historical fact that there were Christians in the first century who were claiming Jesus rose from the dead, and they weren't lying. And according to psychologists, whether Christian or not, it is a scientific fact that group hallucination isn't possible. In other words, if we take no Christian assumptions, none of my personal opinions, we take only opinions that are like universally accepted as fact among historians and scientists, the only possibility we get is that Jesus rose from the dead. And what's the mainstream atheist response? It's that's not possible. I've decided that that's not possible ahead of time, right? That is the response. I do want to talk about what a lot of the common responses to this argument are, right? One of the most common, if not the most common response that I see in, just like comment sections and stuff is atheists saying, so you're saying the resurrection's written in a book and therefore it happened? I could prove anything like that. And if that is what you're saying, then you haven't been paying attention to the argument. No historian in the universe says that, oh, if it's written in a book, then everything written in a book happened, or, everything written in a book didn't happen. People don't think in these black and white terms. When you study history, you have to think, okay, here are some claims about the past. Here are some other claims about the past. So let's use reason to try and determine which claims really happened and which claims did not. In the case of the resurrection of Jesus, we can show they're not lying. We can show that they weren't hallucinating. We can show that this really happened, or at least that most probably it happened, right? You can't say the same for other miracles of other religions. You can't show that. Let me put it this way. I'm gonna give a challenge out there to all of the atheists or any other non-Christian watching. My challenge is find any other miracle in history where there is a group of people who claim to see a thing, and that group of people went to their death for what they were claiming that they saw. In other words, show me any miracle in history where we can prove that they weren't hallucinating and they weren't lying. To my knowledge, there is no miracle in all of history like this, with a few arguable exceptions that are other miracles within the Christian tradition. I want to say I full-heartedly understand that most non-Christians watching this are not like now Christian from watching my video, right? That's not how psychology works. At 15 whatever minute video on YouTube isn't going to just change your mind immediately. But what I would encourage you to do is to really think about this argument and listen to people that are a lot smarter than me that have talked about it. I would encourage you to check out Gary Habermas, like Lacona, Inspiring Philosophy, right? There's a lot of sources, academic and on YouTube, that have talked about this. And whether you come out Christian or not, I would ask you to at least have like a reasonable reason for disagreeing. Don't just say, oh, no evidence for Christianity, and then just ignore the arguments. Have an actual solid response. Show that scholarly consensus is wrong, that they really were lying, or they really were hallucinating, or that there is somehow a logical basis that we should, make a priori assumptions about the possibility of miracles. Have an actual logical reason that you can defend for why Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That's what I ask. All right. So with that in mind, I think that's really about it, everybody. See ya.